Hi everyone. Just putting a quick video together to give you a bit of a helping hand with your assessment task 4.3, looking at stage 3 minimization of the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. I had a request for some of the online students in particular to put together something a bit more comprehensive on DMIS, which I'll do when I get a chance. I'm got a fair bit on this week, but I'll try and do this quick one now just to give you a better handle on what the stage 3 involves. This is a slide from the week 4 lecture, so I'll just put this up and you can review this while we're thinking about it. I think the main thing to keep in mind about stage 3 minimization is that we're in stage 2 we're looking at defense. So we start off with denial, give up the denial, acknowledge that other cultures exist, but then, defensive. So kind of going on the attack towards, cultural difference. If you need a refresher, check out the thread in Moodle for the responses to stage 2, because that's the part of the joy of having them there. You can go back and refresh if you need to. When we get to stage 3 minimization, I think that kind of implies that we've moved beyond the defensive stage. So no longer, sort of defensive, hostile stance towards other cultures, but we're not quite ready to move to the next stage, to stage 4, which is acceptance either. So we're not defensive, but we're not accepting either. So that kind of implies it's a strange spot, and I don't think it's any surprise that Bennett describes this in terms of the most complex strategy for avoiding cultural difference. Because I think what is kind of both interesting and curious and bizarre about the minimization stage is actually, in moving past the defense stage and the defensive kind of knee-jerk reaction, there's kind of there's sort of a halfway acknowledgement of the value of equality and diversity, in insofar as minimization sort of adopts the form of equality and justice, basically. But it adopts the form of justice without the substance, of acceptance of difference and diversity. And so, how do we dodge ethno-relativism and cultural diversity and cultural relativism and multiculturalism, while sort of not being defensive? Well, we adopt the pretense of cultural diversity, and I think this is where this whole the thrust towards minimization comes in, because everyone's equal, but on the terms of the ethnocentrist, or it doesn't even have to be ethnicity. The gender supremacist, the hetero supremacist, and we're talking about sexuality. We've sort of kind of talked about, and we've stressed again and again that we don't need to. It don't even need to think about this in sort of terms of national cultures, because there are any number of culture, excuse me, any number of cultures, internal to any one society, like economic, class cultures between the, the very wealthy with a kind of born to rule mentality, and very individualistic. This week we've been looking at the high and low context verbal communication cultures, individualistic cultures, probably, maybe amongst the the wealthier. There's sort of lack of there's very little kind of social, everyone's sort of out for themselves. There isn't a ton of common understanding, very sort of dog eat dog. So have low context communication, whereas in have differences in amongst maybe if you're like a coming from work class background, you're a member of a union, got a bit of a, like a, culture of worker solidarity, like a classic defending rights, advancing interests kind of thing. But if we're sort of seeking to avoid that, well, I think in the case of class, we kind of tend to downplay uh, you know class-based culture unless it's like a ruling class culture. So we find this minimization thing coming out in terms of like we're all Australians, you know. Yeah, we are all Australians, but then on how do we define Australia? I mean, in whose interests does does that do we make that definition? I mean, I think you find in this is a kind of an interesting point. If you're interested at all in propaganda, you look at the Herald Sun, and they talk a lot about that. I think the masthead of the Herald Sun even says "Wherefore Victoria." But you find a lot of the sort of scaremongering that they carry on with, and a lot of the sort of fear that they peddle. When they say Victoria, they mean the interests of wealthy Victorians. They sort of tend to habitually conflate the interests of the very wealthy and the interests of Victoria at large. I mean, you could consider you could class that as a kind of as a form of minimization, because the interests, cultures, values, beliefs of anyone who sort of don't fit into the mold of the wealthy few, the Tuareg dwellers, tends to sort of be in this case, minimized. So we're looking at we're all allowed to be Victorians, but only or Australians, but within a very, very particular framework, like a very particular class-based framework. So I think that's, in general, that's the idea, but, it's, in this context, we are sort of talking about I mean, this sort of brings in all of the other, the things we were talking about the other week in terms of connecting culture and identity, and how identity can be expressed through language and communication, and as a reflection of like a dominant hegemonic culture. Just to bring in some of the keywords from the first few weeks, but again, as I say, I mean, the way that this sort of minimization dynamic can be applied, can appear in like a multitude of different forms, and the point of doing this exercise is to try and find different ways that this all the multitude of different ways that this can appear. And for those of you who are in the Bachelor of Social Sciences, this is where we get to do a bit of sociology, and it can get quite fascinating. So, yeah, I mean, the thing that to keep in mind is the particular framework, and I think the other thing to keep in mind as well. There's a power dynamic there as well. Like if we think in terms of defining nationalism in terms of the interests of the ruling the oldie ruling class. There's a power dynamic that where culture is minimized, where it might be said to present a threat to power, or even more specifically to privilege. So maybe that's something to keep in mind when looking for an example to look at as well. I mean, how's the sort of minimization dynamic in this sort of sort of the form or pretense of inclusivity without the substance being used to A, defend privilege, and B, undermine or suppress or neutralize forms of culture that might be considered people in positions of power and privilege might consider threatening, or they just don't want to have to deal with. I mean, I think we kind of find that there's an element of this kind of habitual thing to conflate being criticized and being attacked. So I mean, that's the other thing. That's the other interesting thing too that you might want to keep in mind when looking for examples to look at. I mean, there's this. I mean, in the case of sort of ultra nationalism, or this sort of toxic authoritarian way of interpreting patriotism, that like you it's sort of conflated with the privileges of the very rich. And if you anyone who's sort of I mean, if you go on strike or you sort of say, point out the widening gap between rich and poor, and sort of say, well, maybe we should have a bit of a redistribution of wealth or something like that, then people who want to defend the status quo will say, will accuse you of being un-Australian or something like that. I mean, this isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. During the 20th century, there was quite a lot of it. I mean, it was always couched in terms of red baiting. Like if you say too many bad things about the status quo, like of injustice and inequality, then you're a tool of Joseph Stalin. It was sort of done quite habitually. But I mean, that's I mean, you could sort of you could class that kind of thing as a form of minimization. It's sort of being carried out under conditions of anti-communist moral panic. But there are plenty out there, and I think this sort of the sort of anti-communist moral panic example potentially highlights the the power dynamics at play. I mean, you could look at the same thing with with feminism. I think feminism is another great example. Like feminazis trying to subvert the family and undermine the moral order and all this kind of business. I mean, there was not a dissimilar narrative behind the witch hunts. The targeting older women who the patriarchs of the Catholic Church sort of felt to be a threat to their power, because a bunch of crusty old goats in the church targeted old women because they were keepers of folklore and weren't so easy to intimidate into submission. So I think that not to the extent of actually burning women at the stake, but they probably try to do it sort of metaphorically in other ways with feminists these days. But I think because they're not feminists who have a sort of like a strong sense of themselves and ask all the wrong questions about the patriarchal hierarchy and that kind of thing. Are a problem. They're difficult, and they need to be minimized. They need to be minimized in order to keep the world safe for democracy and toxic masculinity and that kind of thing. So I mean, it's sort of like a definite power dynamic involved, so something else to keep in mind. But I mean, whether you're looking at suppressing working class culture, the feminist culture of assertive women, however that may be expressed. I mean, it's about imposing a framework. Where there's an equality, but sort of within a framework which a upholds the status quo, and b probably is protective of power and privileges behind it. And yet, I mean, I think we've sort of looked at the relationship between race and colonial power. The use of the trope of the savage other, which was highly racist. In order to justify colonial land grabs, we need to civilize the heathens. We need, it's just because they're running wild. They're running wild, and they need to be tamed. They need to be tamed and domesticated for their own good. For their own good, because we know everything, and we know how to civilize them. Because there's nothing more civilized than demonizing people in order to justify land grabs and all that kind of business. So I mean, this is the context, and some the historical basis for apparently for a whole bunch of other similar kinds of things. But I mean, I think you probably even class colonialism as a form of minimization. Maybe in addition to the prior stages. Maybe we can even see various kinds of multiple forms of stages in these kinds of historical these kinds of historical episodes. But at the risk of just confusing you even further. I mean, the point I think is to remember that the we've left the defense stage, so we're not defensive, but we haven't quite gotten our heads around the acceptance of other cultures. So we're basically paying lip service. I think we're paying lip service to to the idea of equality, while trying to hold on to whatever privileges are attached to ideas of cultural supremacism, whether it's ethnocentrism, whether it's is there a gender centrism? Maybe that's we need to, if there isn't, maybe we need to sort of coin it. Gender centrism or something like that. The mentalities that sort of uphold status quo built on injustice and insanity to one extreme or another. So yeah, I mean we're we're trying to we're kind of flirting with ethno relativism, with cultural relativism. We haven't quite made it there. So we've got the I mean, I think we're probably recognizing that the what is otherwise, like in stage two, is the the proverbial other, the culturally different. We're recognizing they're actually people. So we're not discriminating against people so much, but they're allowed to be human as long as they conform and assimilate. A bit like the the Borg in Star Trek. So I haven't quite gotten over the Borg mentality yet, but people are allowed to exist and be treated fairly as long as they cease to exist as individuals. So I'm still quite oppressive in that respect. But there's lip service to equality, and I think maybe we move past stage three minimization when we realize that we need to stop paying lip service to ideals of equality and inclusivity and actually apply them in practice. And maybe this is where we move beyond minimization into ethno-relativism and stage four acceptance. I'd be interested to hear more of your thoughts on that one. But let's sort of leave it there. And I think I've already hit you with more than enough to try to digest in one sitting. But hopefully you get a slightly better idea. I mean, I think the main other thing to remember is that this is the last stage of ethnocentrism. I mean, we cross the proverbial Rubicon into ethno-relativism with when we enter stage four. So I mean, it's the last stand for ethnocentrism. So I think it kind of figures that there's sort of like a bit of lip service to inclusivity, as long as it's it sort of operates on the framework of the minimalizer. We're all God's children. Deep down, we're all Australians. Deep down, we're all Westerners. I mean, we're not saying deep down we're all Allah's children, or deep down we're all Buddha's children. I mean, we don't do that. It's deep down we're all God's children. So, culturally kind of referencing. I mean, ourselves. I mean, we don't say, deep down we're all Indians, because we're obviously not, and it doesn't serve our purposes. So, hopefully that helps a little bit. I mean, we've got the color blindness, which also means we don't sort of recognise ongoing issues that need to be dealt with. It's putting down the blinders, but um, yeah, hopefully that will help a little bit in coming up with an example to look at and in formulating your response. If you've got any questions, drop me a line. If you want to run an example past me, please drop me a line as well. But otherwise, I will look forward to seeing what you come up with. All right. Until then.